Hello. Well, it just had the radio on and was playing The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. Manifested that puppy. Today we're going to talk about silence a little bit. Even though I'm acting goofy. The video I did yesterday, which I didn't make it into the car for, there's like hair everywhere. Wow. Was, me reading a large passage from Joel Goldsmith. I'll put a link above to that video if you didn't watch it. One of the things Goldsmith said in that video is very relevant, I think, when it comes to spirituality in general, and certainly spirituality when it comes to a lot of these manifesting ideas. If you're, familiar with this channel, familiar with my advice, generally speaking, you know that I really think you have to figure out what works best for you in terms of these various manifesting techniques and principles. Because there's so many interesting techniques that you can choose and play with and experiment with, and that's great, right? But the way that these techniques are often presented is like as some kind of magical spell or fix or something like that. Like you do sats and it magically happens, or you robotically affirm and it magically happens, or you journal and it magically happens, or whatever. And what Joel Goldsmith was touching upon yesterday is basically that whatever technique you're using, you get to a point where the technique essentially drops away. And that is when truth is realized. You say God is realized if you want to use spiritual language. But there's insight, in that moment. And it stops being about the technique in that moment. He calls it silence in the passage we read yesterday. And, he says it might take a day to reach that silence, or it might take months, or it might take years to reach that silence. Sometimes. In terms of what we want externally, right? To understand, to know, to demonstrate, right? And this is very important and profound, I think. Neville always said, just don't vainly repeat something, right? And we did that video a couple weeks ago. I'll put a link above to it where he says, Neville was saying, I do all this stuff just to convince myself it is so. Basically, just to have that insight, that moment of clarity, to get to that quote-unquote silence. Because when you hit that silence, realize that silence, it's over, it's done. In terms of your mind. There's fulfillment in the realization, in and of itself. And often that fulfillment and realization will demonstrate in some significant way in the external world. What Goldsmith often says is don't worry about the 3D demonstration. You could just go for the realization of what you already are, the recognition of what you already are, which is God, basically, or the universe, or whatever term you want to use. Now, this all sounds pretty esoteric. It is pretty esoteric. But it's important because I'm just asked all the time, am I affirming right? Am I doing this right? And it doesn't matter. What matters is the quote-unquote silence, is the realization. For instance, like robotic affirming. Because on this channel, I've probably discussed robotic affirming. I like calling it active affirming. It doesn't matter exactly how you label it, but we've probably discussed affirming more than most places, especially in its more historical law of attraction context, relating it with Emile Coué, right? And Emile Coué is the connection between so much of this stuff. A bunch of law of assumption stuff and a bunch of the affirming stuff, as well as I would say, the majority of the law of attraction stuff out there, we can trace back to Coué's teachings and philosophy. But when you're robotically affirming something, it's not saying it over and over and over again that's the magic, in my opinion at least. It's when you say something enough times, eventually the silence comes. And again, that's why Neville said, don't just vainly repeat something. See, Neville basically said, don't robotically affirm. He said, you want to feel it. But if you robotically affirm enough, you could say maybe you'll feel it too. See, there's all these different ways, seemingly different techniques that are all pointing to the same thing, which is the silence, the realization of truth of right now. And I'm not one of these people who's going to say, you realize truth and you're going to demonstrate a certain thing. I don't know about that. I don't know. I've seen strange things in my life, and I've heard many strange stories from clients and people I've, worked with, on a one-on-one level about, like, you have this realization, you feel it, and then very odd things happen externally, demonstrate seemingly from that, right? But like what Goldsmith was talking about yesterday is like the realization is fulfillment in and of itself. And you can realize what you already are right now without the external world changing at all. And Goldsmith says, you realize that, quoting the Bible, you realize that, and all these things will be added unto you. Realize God, realize you are one with the Father, and all things will be added unto you. So it's not about affirming something to get something. It's not about visualizing something to get something. All of those tools or techniques are just to have you realize you already have it. If you affirm something enough, if you actively, robotically affirm something enough, you reach a point unconsciously, not through conscious effort, conscious volition, but unconsciously you reach a point where you realize you already have it. That's kind of like what Goldsmith's talking about. It's not simplistic. It's profound. The truth is profound. And it's also forgiving. It's salvation. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or would like a free consultation, I can be reached at info@radicalcounselor.com.